Hello and welcome to Nesta Talks. Today we'll be talking with Dr. Reb Eleanor Johnson. So welcome to you all wherever you are in London at the moment. It's very hot and sunny, so I hope you're all settled and feel somewhere comfortable and are able to concentrate on what is set to be a great discussion. My name is Carrie Deacon and I'll be your host today. I'm excited to help guide us through what I hope will be a fascinating discussion. For those of you who are new to Nesta, Nesta is a global innovation foundation that brings bold ideas to change the world for good. And the Nesta Talks 2 events are an informal series of conversations which we hope to bring some of the most interesting people from around the world, focused on some of the big topics that help define our future. And in an age of overabundance of information, it's hard to know how we can make sense of the world around us and the part we can all play in shaping the future. So we hope in these conversations that they will guide us to some answers, but of course, even more questions probably. But we're talking to today's change makers, community builders and social entrepreneurs to help us understand the world around us. And every month, the conversation focuses on an urgent topic, from mental well-being and equality to climate crisis and the future of humanity. And in even more unsettling times that we're facing at the moment, we need to make sure we work together to remain hopeful and determined to shape the positive futures that we all want. So hopefully a big dynamic conversation today. But before I have the pleasure of introducing you to Reb, I wanted to quickly explain the format of today's conversation. So Rebecca and I will have today's conversation will focus a little bit on a conversation between the two of us, a few questions, but then what we'd like you to do is throughout the discussion in the chat, do put your questions from the beginning. So I'd encourage you to start putting them in as soon as you have them, as soon as they come to mind. And we'll then come to them in 20 minutes and hopefully bring open this conversation to include you all in that. So keep your questions coming. If it's something that's burning on your mind already, or as Reb talks about it, do make sure you add it in there so that we can keep this conversation as interesting and thought-provoking amongst ourselves. It's with great pleasure I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Reb Eleanor Johnson. Reb is a feminist, environmental and peace activist, director of the Acronym Institute for Disarmament Diplomacy, and founding president of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, winning Nobel Peace Laureate for that work, which is amazing. And she lived for years at Greenham Women's Peace Camp in the 1980s, was imprisoned for non-violent campaigning against apartheid and nuclear weapons, organised feminist humanitarian campaigns opposing wars and violence, and strategized for humanitarian disarmament, including the UN's 2017 Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Reb is a prolific writer and a doer, and I hope we're going to hear lots about that today. So thanks for joining us today, Reb. I know it's been a busy weekend and a week in the lead up to this, given that it's the 75th anniversary of the atomic bombs in Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which I hope we'll touch on a little bit about today. But in amidst all of this time of feeling insecure, whether it's the global pandemic or shifting geopolitics, this conversation couldn't be any more timely, I don't think. So Rebecca, Reb, as someone who's been working in this field for a long time, really thinking about the ban of nuclear weapons, but also as a feminist, an activist and researcher, really understanding those connections about what makes us feel secure and insecure. Would you mind starting off by sharing some of your experience on those connections and that deep history of where you see these connections and what change that results in?
Thank you, Carrie. It's great to be here, and I want to thank Nesta and FutureFest very much for inviting me along. You know, as you said, you know, I've been a feminist and a peace campaigner for many, many years, and you know, these themes of war have kind of woven in and out of the various things I've been doing, but a lot really came together in the last 2 or 3 years, I guess, through actually achieving the nuclear ban treaty, actually persuading, you know, 2/3 of the UN General Assembly to negotiate what became the 2017 UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And that's been adopted, and that has been opened for signature by the UN Secretary General. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. But then also, of course, Extinction Rebellion really kind of revived for me just that sense of why I ended up at the Greenham Common Women's Peace Camp, kind of giving up. You know, I was in my early 20s. I'm giving up a whole lot of things that I was planning to do with my life because I thought that we would go to hell in a nuclear war. You know, in the 80s, it really looked as if the US and Russia were, at some point, something was going to go badly wrong and they were going to start using nuclear weapons. And we faced, you know, nuclear winter, nuclear famine that would affect the whole world, essentially nuclear extinction. That's how it felt. And that's why I and loads of young people, particularly young people at that time, as you see with Extinction Rebellion as well, it's very much led by the young people. And I don't just mean Greta Thunberg, although all power to her for just deciding that, you know, if nobody was going to listen to her, she was going to sit herself outside her parliament and you know, go out on school strike. But she inspired all those, you know, millions of young people from around the world to do the same, to go on school strike if they were at school, to go out on the streets, and of course, Extinction Rebellion. And I got involved in that late in 2018, and then very involved during 2019 in the rebellions in various capacities. And out of that, we formed XR Peace, which was actually trying to say, okay, but the militarism and war are massive contributors towards climate destruction. And they actually make it almost impossible to engage in climate justice, because these are, you know, global threats. And through all of that, and through being part of XR and linking up climate and what I've been doing and what I'm still doing to abolish nuclear weapons, we then ended up with COVID. And of course, as I'm now 65, I'm very much seen as being part of the very vulnerable community in that. And you know, we all got locked down, and I started writing songs again about lockdown, like you do. And then I was, I guess, prompted to research what happened 100 years ago with the Spanish flu, so-called, which was nothing to do with Spain, but it was an H1N1. It was a coronavirus influenza pandemic, and it killed 30 million people around the world. And I started doing some research and found out how it had sort of potentially 3 sites of origin, all of which were associated with that First World War, the 1914 to 1918 World War. It was with at a training camp in the US, which was mainly training farm boys to become soldiers to come over in the final year of the fighting. But it was also appeared in, I think it was 1916 or 1917, in both France and the UK, again, amongst the military. And I started to look at and think about all of this and just be putting all of those issues together, which is why what I want to talk about really is how we get security wrong. You know, we are living in countries that far too often only think in terms of national and, in fact, nationalist security. But the threats we face are global. They're environmental. They're to do with our industrial destruction of the climate. They're to do with pandemics, which may or may not have a human or a laboratory connection, but are about how we treat animals and the other creatures in the world, how we've been destroying our environment in the rainforest, in rainforests of all the countries, the seas, the oceans. So we have to change how we think of security. We have to see security as something which is humanitarian And I mean that by which, you know, that connects up human, environmental, climate. So it takes into account Mother Earth. And let's not be embarrassed about actually remembering we live on a small planet that many human peoples throughout all of our history, prehistory, thought of as our Mother Earth because we depend on her. We have to connect today's challenges, which are all military industrial threats, with thinking again about our relationship to nature, our relationship to our countries, and the interconnections, and Black Lives Matter also really coming to the fore this year because of the murder of George Floyd. And also, let's not forget Breonna Taylor, a young woman who was actually part of emergency, I think the emergency medical services in the United States, who was murdered by police just before, a couple months before George Floyd, in her own home, because they had got the address wrong. They were looking for somebody involved in drugs. She was unarmed. She wasn't involved in any way in drugs. She was 25 years old and working as a medical technician, and she was gunned to death. Why don't you hear about her? Because she was a young woman. And again, it's good that we heard about George Floyd, and we recognize that that was also because the horror of his murder was captured on video. But we have to connect these things up, you know, because you know, racism and sexism interconnect, as you know, Kimberly Crenshaw really noticed and started to write about with her work on intersectionality. And I want to bring that in to how I critique national security, because that's really the problem. That keeps countries against each other. They're looking always at enemy images, and how we use that in othering other countries, but how within our own countries, minoritized people who are most disadvantaged in terms of health and education, and we've seen this with COVID, are othered and not treated as though, not only not treated as though the lives all matter the same, and they should, all of our lives should, but also not treated as if the security of some of our communities matters as much as the national security. And this is really what I would hope we can talk about today, how these things connect, and then also what we can do about them, because we're responsible. It's not just about the government out there. The personal is political. You know, I learned that with my early feminism in the 1970s, and of course the political is personal. So what can we do personally and political to make the change that we have to make?
Fantastic, thanks, Reb. I think that point really is so pertinent. I think even in the newspapers over the weekend, we saw the othering of refugees coming to the shores of the UK, and it's so in everything that we're seeing at the moment. But those interconnections that you're mentioning so often are overlooked at the moment, and in some regards, the weight of change, or the weight of politics, certainly feels like to be going more domestic, more nationalistic than this opening up and this internationalism, and being able to see these connections and know that only by working together and exploring these things can we unpin and solve these interconnections. So what would you see as the first ways that we can start to make the case for internationalism at the moment, when the weight is pulling us back the other way?
Well, I think it's actually out there, and we see it. Nobody imagines we can really tackle COVID all by ourselves, individually in countries. Although I have to say that women leaders in a number of governments, I'm thinking of Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, Aotearoa, New Zealand, Ardern rather, and also I'm thinking, although I don't like the conservative politics by and large of many in Angela Merkel's party, I look at how she deals with issues, and I see someone immensely impressive and actually really very internationalist, someone with really a very human heart in how she looks at these issues. And I think we need to recognize that this all transcends our political parties. And so one of the things that I've been looking at, for example, is Green New Deals. I'm the Green Party spokesperson here in England and Wales on security, peace and defence. So I'm looking at how we can update our policies with regard to, you know, security and defence and peace making. Peace is something you have to make. It's not something, you know, it's not the opposite of war. The two go together, they intertwine. And what we have to do is constantly make the peace that we want to see and constantly undermine and reduce the power of the militarism that makes war. Don't be fooled by the idea that the more weapons you have, the more peaceful you can make the world or even make your own society. That used to, you know, that's a kind of framing that the military and, you know, a lot of the politicians have, and they end up with nuclear weapons, which threaten the entire globe. If only less than 1% of today's roughly 13,400 nuclear weapons. Did you know there's that many nuclear weapons
No.
in the hands of just 9 countries? Just 9 countries threaten the entire world. Now, if less than 1% of those weapons were to be used on major cities, and let's face it, that's where they would but mostly be used. The governments try to tell you that they'd do some kind of a warning shot across the bows, like the Belgrano or something, which was not a shot across the bows, of course, but it was treated as if it was in the Falklands War. They're trying to say, oh, well, we have to have these weapons because that's what keeps the peace. We have to have them to deter. But that is like somebody who puts a load of explosives in their attic to deter the possibility of a burglary, when what they really need is a fire extinguisher and not to have any, you know, petrol or explosives or, you know, or inflammable things. And an insurance policy isn't the thing that stops a terrible disaster happening. It's what is supposed to pay some money to help any survivors. Look at the Lebanon. I mean, look at the tragedy that has happened there because some highly flammable, explosive materials that actually are used for a variety of different kinds of explosives and various kinds of landmines and bombs and things like that. You know, a warehouse full of that blew up. We don't yet know the reason. We do know the impacts. We know the consequences. Something like that should never happen. Scotland has to store, on behalf of the UK, has to store basically most of the 210 nuclear weapons that the UK has. Scotland doesn't want any nuclear weapons. The Scottish people, time and time again, say they don't want any nuclear weapons. They voted for a party that is completely opposed. Yet not only do they have to store over 210 British nuclear weapons decided by government in Westminster, only about 40 miles north of Glasgow, their, you know, largest city, but they do the very complicated process of attaching those warheads to the US Trident missiles by a shiplift, you know, in the small port going from that to onto the Trident submarines. So they have to put a warhead onto the Trident missile and then onto the Trident submarines. And then the Trident submarines with 40 of those warheads on about 8 actual missiles, because several can go on one missile, go out on a nuclear powered submarine. Again, massive danger attached to that. They go round first to Faslane, which is just around the corner on the Loch. It's a small journey by road. And then one submarine goes out to sea and starts playing war games for a month or a couple of months at a time. And then it has to come back into Faslane. And the next one goes out full of its, 40 warheads, while the warheads on the one that's come back in have to go round to Coolport, and that complicated procedure of taking the warheads off of the missiles and stored. And not just stored, then a certain number of them, around 6 at a time, get put onto lorries. They get taken by road from Coolport round Glasgow, or sometimes they go via Stirling round Edinburgh. They then either go down the M6 or they go down so they either go down the west coast down the M6, or they go down the east coast on A roads, then the M1. They then either go past Birmingham, past Oxford, round down the M40 until they get to Aldermaston, where I was yesterday, commemorating what one much smaller bomb did to the city of Nagasaki, because yesterday was the 75th anniversary. Those convoys go 6 or 7 times a year with warheads, and they go around our motorways, on A roads and on smaller roads. If they were to they have had accidents in the past. They've slipped off the road on ice many years ago. They've often been stopped and had problems going round roundabouts. They've broken down. We have to hope this never happens, but it happened to Lebanon, that something that was being stored dangerously did blow up. Well, there's a lot of lorries on our motorways at the same time as the nuclear warhead convoy, carrying explosive materials, oxygen tanks, explosive materials, petrol, all of those kinds of things. And so, an accident could happen. And an accident like that could, even if it doesn't, it would cause a massive explosion, because each warhead not only has the plutonium and the highly enriched uranium of the nuclear bomb, like the ones from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. All nuclear bombs have plutonium and or highly enriched uranium, but they're packed with high explosives. So we have to think about that and think about what we do. And so I have here one of the things that the Scottish people chose to do. I don't know, can you see that?
We can, yes.
So the Green Party in Scotland paid for these are very light, you can see the holes in them. And when I lived in Scotland for 2 years myself, while we were doing a year of protests at Faslane nuclear base, Faslane 365 it was called, every time we heard a convoy was coming out, a group of people would go out onto the roads and attach these on any of the roads likely to be used by the nuclear convoy, because we knew they basically had 2 routes that they took to warn motorists. And Nukewatch, which is a UK-based, goes right down, has people in Southampton, people who live very near Aldermaston and Burfield, who watch the base and alert people when it comes out. Very much what we did at Greenham Common when the nuclear weapons convoys of the 1980s, the cruise missiles at Greenham Common, were brought into Greenham Common by the Americans and then started to go out into the countryside. So that's something very individual, you can do, get your, if you're part of a local party, commit the party, get the party to commit, get your members of parliament to commit. 3 things I'll say on this. 1, to sign up to pledging to work for Britain to join the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, this UN treaty that I talked about. You know, it's now got 44 states parties, which means, you know, I don't know if you know about the way treaties work, but treaties get negotiated. This was multilaterally negotiated in the UN General Assembly. This was therefore open, invited government representatives from every single government represented in the UN General Assembly. Governments choose whether they participate in the negotiations, that's always the case, but every government was invited to be part of those negotiations. To the eternal shame, this government, led at that time by Theresa May, boycotted because, guess what? The Trump administration wanted to boycott. But some members of parliament did come. Caroline Lucas came, Fabian Hamilton, who was the spokesperson on, a Leeds MP, spokesperson for Labour on peace and disarmament, security and disarmament issues, came. A number of, I think there were members of the Scottish and the Welsh Parliament came too. So some members of Parliament. So first thing to do is sign up to your member of Parliament, ask them to sign the parliamentary pledge from ICAN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. Ask your local councillor to sign, because we used to have nuclear-free local authorities in the 80s that actually stopped these weapons and nuclear fuel convoys going through past their cities. We still have nuclear-free local authorities. People have forgotten that. And Edinburgh and Manchester and 2 or 3 others have signed themselves up to abide by the treaty. Obviously, they're not a government of a country. They can't join the UK to the treaty. Nicola Sturgeon, First Minister of the of Scotland, has clearly said that that if Scotland becomes independent, when, she says, of course, she says when, that they will refuse to have the UK nuclear weapons and they will sign the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. But you can actually sign your cities up to it. So, you know, that's something that you can do. You can practically contact Nukewatch, because if you're driving on the motorway and you see this, take a photograph, alert Nukewatch, and, you know, I can give Nesta some of these websites and phone numbers and things like that. So you put pressure. Now, before I leave that subject, something else is that because of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Setsuko Nakamura Thurlow, who was a 13-year-old schoolgirl in Hiroshima when her school was less than I think she was about 1 kilometer away from the epicenter of the Hiroshima bomb that was dropped. Her whole school collapsed. Somehow she and 2 other girls managed to crawl out, not too badly injured, and they were pulled free by a man passing. It broke her heart. She could hear some of her friends who were alive under that rubble calling out for help, calling out for water, calling out for their mothers. But what happened as part of that bomb was that everything caught fire. There was a massive blast, and then there was a massive fireball. So this man that had rescued the 3 of them pulled them away, hearing still their school friends' cries, and their friends burnt to death, she wrote a letter to Boris Johnson, our Prime Minister, and the leaders of all the UN member states, the leaders of all countries who could have and should have been part of the negotiations on the treaty. And she also, at the request of the ICAN partners, the civil society partners in Scotland, she wrote to Nicola Sturgeon, because Nicola Sturgeon had said she wanted an independent position on the nuclear treaty. So she wrote to Scotland as well as Boris Johnson, but she wrote to Boris Johnson. She described the suffering, what that was like. And remember, this was a nuclear bomb, 15 kilotons, that was 1/8 the size of the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. Sorry, 1/8 of the size of the bomb, of one bomb on Trident nuclear weapons. That's what I wanted to be saying. And in that letter, she called on him to become a state party to the treaty. On Hiroshima Day, Ireland, Nigeria, and a third country did become, Niue in Pacific Island, did become states parties. They chose Hiroshima Day to honor the survivors, the hibakusha. And on Nagasaki Day, St. Kitts and Nevis joined, and it was some of our Black women from here in Britain, from the Caribbean community, that played a really important role in reaching out to the government of St. Kitts and Nevis, and they became a states party. Now, they're a small country by comparison, but they have every right to say that they don't want their people to die of nuclear war. So these seem like they're small steps, but they connect up. And when a group of us from the Aldermaston Women's Peace Camp were at Aldermaston yesterday commemorating the Nagasaki bombing with lanterns down the Kennet River, we also went to the main gate of the nuclear bomb factory at Aldermaston, which has made and tested every nuclear weapon that the UK has ever had. And we put in, or we tried to put in, Setsuko's letter, a copy of Setsuko's letter to Boris Johnson. Also, some information from faith groups, from a number of different faith groups, about the importance of taking your investments out of nuclear weapons. A lot of people have pensions or investments, or, you know, city councils have investments in nuclear weapons. So there were, you know, this group, faith group, put in, I don't have it right here, sorry, but a report about how to divest. Don't Bank on the Bomb has some great resources. Yeah. We put that in. We put an article that just came out last week, an editorial from Nature magazine, calling on scientists not to make nuclear weapons, but to work on verifying and enabling nuclear disarmament and the verification of the nuclear prohibition and other nuclear limitation treaties. We tried to put that in through the gate. We held banners and demonstrations there. They refused to accept it, but they said we could post it, so we're going to post it. But we did that because we think they need to know this letter, because Boris Johnson has not bothered to reply to Setsuko Thurlow, an 88-year-old, you know, Nobel laureate, who we had chosen to be one of the two women that accepted this Nobel Peace Prize. We were given 13 of these medals to share around the world. This was a collective Nobel Peace Prize, but Setsuko was one of the two women that we chose to accept this on behalf of ICAN. And she wrote to Boris Johnson, and he has not bothered to reply. Nicola Sturgeon has replied and promised to join the treaty as soon as she can. So these are things at big levels and small levels that we can do on that. And it's the same with climate. And it's the same with anti-racism. You know,
and we've got some questions coming in on that, Reb. So all about that kind of how we're making the personal political and the political personal. So I just wanted to open it up and see what some of the people have been saying. I think very emotional, like knowing that people are experiencing this and sharing that experience, but it's still not breaking through to our leaders, but the power of those stories and how we need to keep relaying them. So Anna has shared a question and said, what do you think it needs to change to strengthen the power of young people? You talk really passionately about the role of young people leading some of the XR movement and the narrative around some of this. So what do you think it will take to really strengthen the power of young people?
Well, first I'd say young people have the power. I would like to see the voting age go down to 16. I have met just such terrific young people particularly through XR, which you know, the young people are in the lead. Let's us help them to use that leadership and that passion they have of preventing climate extinction. And I always make the connections, and they're now increasingly making the connections themselves, military, war, and nuclear extinction. Let's allow them. Let's bring in the legislation so that they can vote at the age of 16. They are intelligent enough to be able to make the right choices. They're already making the right choices through XR and XRPs and all their local activities. And you see a lot of young people out with Black Lives Matter as well. So they should be the voters. They should join the voters. So that's one very practical thing that we should be doing as, you know, older people, is making sure that 16-year-olds and above can vote in all of our elections. That's how it should be. I think that we need to engage much more. You know, I was in my 20s, as I said, when I went to Greenham Common, and Greenham Common was very much a young people's, a young women. I mean, and again, by making Greenham women only, which we did in 1982, the camp started in 1981, had a number of problems with men who were part of, it had been women led from the beginning, but there was some men, there was some problems actually through certain amounts of violence, I think was the major thing. And we have to connect up also, you know, violence against women and girls, it doesn't go away. During COVID, it actually increased. That we have had to be wrestling with high-profile so-called male peace leaders, or at least self-promoting peace leaders, who've actually used abuse, sexual violence, sexual harassment against women in peace and disarmament organizations. We saw this also in some of the humanitarian organizations. Oxfam had its problems, as we recall. That kind of harassment doesn't only belong to the, you know, the abuse of women isn't only done by, you know, the rich white men like, you know, Weinstein and you know, Jeffrey Epstein. It's at all levels of society, no matter what your class, no matter if you're working on peace, it just becomes another place. They call themselves feminists, they work for peace, and then they use those roles in order to get access to young women. And we found that with ICAN, because when we set up ICAN from 2007 onwards, we deliberately built it to be a place where young people, young women in particular, had equal access to the leadership. We brought in partners. We have partners in Africa, partners in Latin America as part of the steering group, partners in the Pacific, Japan, as well as European. But we're still white dominated, I have to say. We've got about gender equality, but too many European organizations in the steering group. That has to be changed. So we have to take that. Million Women Rise in this country takes the, you know, is led by Black and minoritized women for all women, takes on the leadership in opposing violence against women and girls, and also makes the connections with the violence against refugees, women incarcerated in the prison system, in the deportation system, and so on. So these are ways, and a lot of the women in Million Women Rise are also a younger generation than me. I'm one of the older women that supports. And if you're older and you're white women and you want to do this, do it in solidarity. We don't need to always be in leadership positions. We need to do it in solidarity, which means sometimes stepping back and creating the space for young people, Black women, to take the leadership that is in them, to use, their own voices. And if I can make those connections and then use my voice to bring about a situation in which more young people have the confidence and the positions to speak for themselves, I will feel that my job has been done.
And I think it's that elevating people up. It sounds like you've got a long history of doing that, Reb, as well. Another question here that kind of builds on but offers a different angle from Michael, saying that COVID is making human beings more inward looking and more questioning of excessive capitalism and consumerism. But how can individuals and leading pressure groups work together more as one to change our lifestyles and transform national politics and the world together? So how do we enable that collaboration?
Oh, that's another great question. There's been this Build Back Better, which I think started in 2008 with a lot of different groups coming together and saying, okay, the banks have all crashed. How can we transform the economy and build back better so that we are tackling climate? We knew about climate in 2008 by that time, and all of these sorts of issues. I was not surprised, but also kind of horrified when in one of his press conferences, Boris had build on the record, but then stole that, said, and we've got to build back better, build. What did that remind me of? It was George W. Bush in 2003, burn, baby, burn, or maybe it was Rumsfeld who actually used that phrase, as they went on that disastrous war supported by Tony Blair to Labour's eternal shame, or to, our eternal shame, because despite over 1 million people marching against Britain being part of that war, went to war and caused continuing collapse, destruction, war, and utter human misery throughout the whole region of the Middle East. Where do you think these refugees trying to cross the channel are coming from? They are coming from countries destroyed by the wars that our military has been sent to be part of. They're our responsibility. So I know there are a lot of groups. CND has joined, so I hear a little bit about the Build Back Better, but I'm not sure how successful they can be if they're having even their slogans co-opted. But of course, that's exactly the nature of Cummings and Boris Johnson. But what can we do? Well, one of the other things that I've been looking at, and I just alluded to it, is looking at what a Green New Deal would look like. Now, again, that is something Caroline Lucas and others got together and started to argue for in 2008. And I started to do more research into that. And actually, I gave a lecture on that only about a month ago at a thing called the Global University and the 7th South Forum on Sustainability, which is led by people from China, Brazil, Pacific, basically South leadership, but which is global. And I was on the panel with people from India, some really terrific, other speakers from Africa and so on. Now, they were talking about initiatives they were taking, and I'd been asked to talk about sort of Green New Deals and XR. And in studying the Green New Deal more fully, I realized that it couldn't just be the economic analysis that had been thought of much more back in 2008. We had to have a feminist humanitarian Green New Deal in which, for example, we recognize that green jobs are not only environmental jobs, not only, although they include moving from the military industrial type jobs, the ones that, pump out the climate destroying chemicals that are focused all on, making things that then get thrown away because you have to make your profit based on growth constantly from bringing in markets that will, so, all our computers, they get obsolete very, very quickly, so that, it's the same with phones that use, minerals, from conflict areas, the tungsten and the cobalt, the different minerals that are used in most of our phones are war minerals. They're blood minerals, just like diamonds, blood gold. Make these connections. Make the connections with people out in those countries. But a feminist, humanitarian Green New Deal would be looking at what are the jobs, and care jobs are green jobs. So not only, and I look out and I can see a wind farm because there's a wind farm, in sight of my home. I think it's great because they are a sustainable, renewable source of energy. I'd much rather have that than either nuclear, which is not sustainable or renewable and creates masses of toxic waste, or any of the fossil fuel. So we have to have that. But we also have to invest in our care jobs. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean exactly the jobs that we've needed over COVID. The care people, the health people, the NHS, the bus drivers and the drivers, these are all the jobs that we have actually come to rely on. And, so we have to build our economy around much more localized production. So bring the jobs back locally, local food growing, so that we're not transporting that long distance. That began to happen with COVID-19. So but let's not let the government turn it now back into if public transport is something you're feeling scared about, get back in your car, because this is going to destroy the climate again. It'll carry on destroying the climate. Let's make our public transport safe. Let's pay our public transport workers proper living wages. Let's acknowledge that they are some of the lowest paid workers. Let's make our hospitals really fully fit for purpose. And let's build the PPE here. Let's make the PPE all here. Let's not be transporting PPE halfway around the world, and then it comes here and we discover that the Chinese imports the Tory governments have aren't good enough. They're not safe enough for our care workers. So it's local economies, local energy with solar, wind, other forms of local energy that can be developed at a local basis, which will greatly reduce how much energy has to go into the central grid. And then local production, localized jobs, and localized decision making. Again, if the 16-year-olds are voting, have them vote locally as well, and we will get the jobs and the green feminist New Deals that we need.
There's another couple of questions. So Anna and Romy both talked about how it can be difficult to feel like you can make big changes. So Anna wrote that Polly Higgins asked us to dare to be great and make ecocide an international crime, and Romy asked about the organisation of XR in the streets of London, and that was a successful protest. But also cited that laws in current government immediately kind of tried to limit the protests. And Anna mentioned that it's even a struggle to get our current government to make change to stuff like the school curriculum to cover stuff like Black Lives Matter. So how, when we feel that even these small changes are hard to make, how can we be hopeful? And really, to wrap us off a little bit here, Reb, what are the reasons to be optimistic that we can make change? You're a woman who's made change collaboratively with others around the world. What could we do to take forward that and feel like we can make change?
Well, it's actually believing that if you speak up, if you see racism, if you see sexism, if you see sexual harassment, if your curriculum doesn't have, Black Lives Matter and a critical analysis, and doesn't allow for a critical analysis of Britain's military, industrial, colonialist past, and an involvement in the slave trade and slavery. If you don't have those, raise them in your schools, raise them in your colleges, and get your parents and your families and your teachers to support you in saying this is what needs to happen. So we will also work on getting, I know Black Lives Matter is now looking at anti-racist, anti-colonialist teaching. It's not about erasing those histories. All of those histories happened. The bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki happened. So let's acknowledge what's happened and say, what do we need to learn from that? What needs to be in our education to teach us about that? And then how do we need to change? So it's connecting that up with the treaties. Now at Greenham, we chose to have the symbolism of the spider's web. The spider was always a female and weaving the web and things like that. And I always love to think of it as every single strand of a web is actually very fragile. And when I went to Greenham, on my little motorbike in 1982, I was just one person, and I just went there because I felt I had to do something to stop nuclear war. Just like I think a lot of young people are just thinking we have to do something to stop climate destruction because that's our future. But you think of the web, and as it connects, you have these strands coming. You can think of it either as coming out from the center or coming from the outside in, because we need both of that. We need to reach out and we need to reach in. We need to reach out to people all around us, in our families. Don't be afraid to speak up, even if somebody mocks you. If you see racism, speak up in defense of somebody that is being harassed. If you see any kind of abuse, or if you hear words used that are really wrong, challenge it on an individual level. I bet you there will be others who are feeling just as scared as you about saying something, but if you say it, they will. And that's the way to make change. That's how Greta Thunberg began to make her change, was one young woman. And so the spider web, then you have all those interconnecting bits of a spider web, of course. Now, we actually had this great poster that had the barbed wire of the military base, a spider web between it, and the nuclear weapon trapped by that. That nuclear weapon can be a weapon. It can be, the fossil fuels. It's everything that you want to get trapped in the power of you as one individual, having the courage to say and do something, and then realizing that you're connected. Now, XR, the last part of that question, and because I know that, okay, XR did brilliantly in both the April Rebellion and the October Rebellions, but also some mistakes were made, and there has to be some reflection on that. But actually, this is a COVID time when a lot of people are afraid, and rightly so, of all ages, because let's not forget, young people may not get it quite so badly, but some of them do. And also some of them are being locked down with their grandparents, looking after, their grandparents who are very vulnerable. So XR has to find also innovative ways to, transmit our messages in ways that keep us all safe. Obviously, masks will have to be worn. some of the lock-ons that we did, lock on to boat and thing, we may have to think about those again. We may have to take a leaf out of some of the things that we did in the anti-nuclear movement of projecting messages onto the House of Commons. You know, nuclear weapons are a war crime. You can do that with just a projector. Beam that on some, you know, fossil fuel factory. It doesn't have to be just London, Manchester, London, Cardiff. Yes, I think it was London, Manchester and Cardiff XR shows. Do it in your own town as well. That's also okay. Spread it and do it safely for yourself and those that you love, because we're going to have COVID with us for a very long time. But do it in some form. Let your voice be heard through music, through talk, through activism, and through political activism in whatever political arena you are in, whether it's a political party or a group. Be part of XR Peace, be part of Million Women Rise, be part of ICAN, be part of the schools strike for the climate. You know, it's for all of us, because if even one strand breaks or goes away, it leaves a hole. And the hole is where the missile gets through. Don't leave a hole. Be part of the world's web of activism against nuclear and climate annihilation, racism, and and misogyny, let me say.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Reb. I think we could talk for hours. There's lots of things that we haven't even managed to pull the strands from that. But I think I hope that we all feel that we can go off and build our own webs and connect those to each other to start building for this more secure and just future together. And as you said, lots of innovation to be done to make sure that we can face these opportunities in the more testing times. So thank you so much for tuning in, everyone. And thank you so much for your time, Reb. Do sign up to the newsletter for future events coming up. This will be shared on video as well. So we have some events coming up. Writer and theorist Mackenzie Walk on the thinkers of the 21st century, and behavioural insights team Elspeth Kirkman, now on secondment at Nesta, will be giving us a primer on behavioural insights, so do check those out. We're adding new events every month, so sign up, and hopefully today you can go off and start building your web for a more secure future together. So enjoy your afternoon and your day wherever you are. Thanks a lot for tuning in.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks, Reb.